America in the early 1960s faced a dark reality, and something new and refreshing was needed to help entertain people during these dark times. Music was used as a primary escape, and the rise of British culture in the States was certainly a factor. The 1960s was a period of peace, love, and change, and this can be attributed to several events, but the frontier artists of the British invasion truly added to it. The Beatles' first visit to America on February 7, 1964, led to a period of British Renaissance in the United States, becoming leading frontiers in music, culture, and social standards. Rock and roll music rose to popularity in the 1950s, quickly becoming a recognizable musical style that seemed like a mix of rhythm and blues as well as up-tempo jazz and swing music. Chuck Berry, known as the father of rock and roll by many, was an early star during the 1950s. His songs Johnny B. Goode and Roll Over Beethoven were very popular amongst teenagers in the 50s and paved the way for what was to come. Along with Chuck Berry, Little Richard and Buddy Holly and the Crickets were also very popular, with hit songs like Tutti Frutti and Everyday dominating the radio. But perhaps the most iconic rock and roll star of the 1950s was Elvis Presley. His believed to be provocative dance moves were seen as troublesome, and many thought that he tainted the youth, but this didn't stop him from becoming a huge star. That's Alright was a huge success, and other songs like Hound Dog and Love Me shot Elvis to a new level of fame that was yet to be seen in the 50s. However, this period of carefree rock and roll music only lasted a short while before tragedy struck. All throughout the 50s, African American artists, who basically frontiered rock and roll music to becoming a widely known genre, were not seen as important as the white artists that came after them. This, along with segregated radio play and concert attendance, added to the struggles that many faced during this decade. In late 1957, Elvis got a draft notice in the mail for the United States Army. His career was put on a hold as he was to serve in the Army from 1958 to 1960. Colonel Tom Parker, who was Elvis's manager, forbid Elvis from recording any new material while in the Army, instead opting to routinely release compilation albums of his singles and hit songs over the 2 years that he would be gone. The day the music died is a common way that people describe February 3, 1959. On that day, Cricket's frontman Buddy Holly, Ritchie Valens, J.P. Richardson, known as the Big Bopper, and their pilot all died in a horrible plane crash that was believed to be caused by a rough snowstorm that was going on at the time of their departure. This horrific event, along with other notable issues, brought the decade of influential frontiers that rose rock and roll to popularity to a dire close. The 1960s began with little musical fanfare. Many musicians from the golden age of the 50s were still putting out new records, but none were really doing too much in the charts. It also didn't help that many Americans were occupied by the several issues happening during the early 60s. The Vietnam War and the Civil Rights Movement were in full swing at this time, but an event that shook American culture was the assassination of President John F. Kennedy on November 22, 1963. The assassination of the 35th President of the United States caused great tension in America, and the issues of race and war also added to the difficult time that was the early 1960s in America. Another event took place on November 22, 1963, this time taking place across the globe in the United Kingdom. A band named The Beatles released their second studio album known as With the Beatles, and only a few days later the band released the single I Want to Hold Your Hand in the UK. Formed in 1957 as the Quarrymen, later changed to the Beatles, the band, which went through several different members before a dominant four was set in stone, consisted of John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison, and Ringo Starr. The Fab Four were quite popular in the UK, already releasing their singles, Love Me Do and Please Please Me, to decent success. These singles were also released in the US a few days after the original UK release, but flopped hard. Many did not care for the band in their early days over in the US, but on December 26, 1963, the Beatles released the single that changed their career forever. I Want to Hold Your Hand completely took over the US music charts, shooting the band from being a relatively unknown British rock band to becoming known nationwide in a matter of days. With their newfound popularity in the US, it was only a matter of time before the Fab Four paid a visit to their American fans, and when the band found out that they were booked by The Ed Sullivan Show, history was about to be made. On February 7, 1964, the Beatles made their first visit to the United States. Thousands of fans greeted them with signs and shrieks of joy as they arrived at JFK Airport in New York City. Moments later, they were faced with their first U.S. press conference where they were asked many questions about their music, along with other things.
I got a question. Do you hope to get a haircut at all? No. Nope. No, thanks. I had one yesterday.
Their primary reason for visiting the U.S. was for their televised performance on The Ed Sullivan Show that took place 2 days later on February 9, 1964. Over 73 million people tuned in to watch the band, meaning that 45% of American households were watching the iconic performance. They frontiered what many refer to as the beginning of the British invasion in America. The Beatles started a phenomenon that led to countless British musicians taking over American radios. The Rolling Stones, the Zombies, the Who, and the Kinks, just to name a few, quickly gained notoriety amongst American teenagers and music lovers alike. These frontiers added a new sound to pop and rock music at the time, adding excitement and passion to the music industry, which needed it more than ever during this time. Keith Richards from the Rolling Stones, when describing their first visit to the US, stated, "Arriving from the airport, we were surprised at the size of the crowd waiting for us at the hotel, but they were all pretty well behaved." The Beatles in particular were everywhere during this time, with this period being known as Beatlemania. Every little thing imaginable had a version with the Fab Four on it. Lunchboxes, toy guitars, Halloween costumes, bobbleheads, hairspray, blow-up dolls, bath soap, self-adhesive tape. If you could slap the Beatles on it, it would sell. The Beatles even starred in their first movie called A Hard Day's Night, which got $11 million at the box office, a number that, due to inflation, would be equal to nearly $100 million today. Sir Paul McCartney, when reflecting on this era of the band, stated, "John was the smart, acerbic one, George was the quiet one, Ringo was the funny one, and I was typecast as the cute one." Several of the musicians that gained popularity from the British invasion were heavily inspired by American musicians from the 1950s. Elvis Presley and Chuck Berry alone influenced the sound and overall attitude of many from this era, with the Beatles even being described as 4 British Elvis Presleys by critics. The popularity of the musicians from the British invasion hit their peak in 1964, but over the next 2 years that popularity began to dwindle, and what it meant to be fab was put into question. Rock and roll music was always a bit controversial among many Americans, specifically the older crowd. Since the 1950s, several people have seen rock music as satanic or harmful to our youth. Elvis Presley wasn't even allowed to dance with his music, or shake his hips if you will. When he appeared for the third and final time on the Ed Sullivan Show, he was shot from the waist up, preventing audiences at home from seeing any inappropriate body movements. This mindset even carried on to the 1960s, when the majority of British invasion boy bands had the mop top haircut, which was seen as rebellious and dangerous by many adults, even causing it to be banned at some schools in the US. A notable controversy from this era is the permanent ban of the Kinks from touring in the US, which was put into effect after a rowdy concert performance that involved the band playing a 45-minute version of their song You Really Got Me as payback to some people that they had a running feud with. But perhaps the biggest controversy that came from this period happened to the Beatles in the summer of 1966. John Lennon was quoted as saying, "Christianity will go, it will vanish and shrink. I needn't argue about that. I know I'm right and I'll be proved right. We're more popular than Jesus now. I don't know what will go first, rock and roll or Christianity. Jesus was alright, but his disciples were thick and ordinary. It's them twisting it that ruins it for me." This offhand remark was not taken seriously when it was published in a British pop magazine in the summer of 1966, but when it made its way over to America, many did not take it very well at all. What John had said had been taken out of context by many publications. He wasn't saying that they were better than Jesus. He was just saying that the Beatles had gotten to the point where they meant as much to kids as Jesus did. Despite cleaning up his comments on a televised statement that took place on August 11th, 1966,
"We meant more to kids than Jesus did, or religion at that time. I wasn't knocking it or putting it down, I was just saying it as a fact."
thousands were still furious about the situation. Beatle burnings were held where people would not only stomp, rip apart, and destroy Beatles merchandise, they would put it in piles and light it on fire. There was even an account where members of the Ku Klux Klan attached Beatles records to a wooden cross and proceeded to burn it all to the ground.
We're known as a terror organization. I think we have
a terror organization.
We have ways and means to stop this if this is going to be the case, yes.
This incident, along with others that happened to other British musicians in the later half of the 60s, brought the true days of the British invasion to a close, beginning a new era of experimentation and new music that would be created in the years to come. Regardless of the controversies that happened toward the end of the British invasion, they still heavily impacted American culture. Clothing and style were influenced by the image of many British musicians, especially later on in the 60s because of their polished outfits and never before utilized hairstyles. Social change was another notable influence by the British invasion, with the advent of anti-war messages and songs preaching the ideals of love and peace, leading to a huge cultural impact even beyond the 60s. Their music influenced many artists, new and old, and they even frontiered a second British invasion that took place in the late 70s and early 80s. Musicians like the Police, Sex Pistols, and the Clash all gained huge popularity during this time, and like the British invasion of the 1960s, their influence can still be seen in music today. Countless powerhouse artists of the 21st century all cite at least one British invasion era artist as a huge inspiration to them. Over 50 years since the first US visit of the Beatles on February 7th, 1964, and the arrival of several new and unique British musicians made a colossal impact on America in not just the 60s, but for years since then. It frontiered a new era of music, culture, and overall lifestyle that had yet to be seen in America at that time, effectively changing the way we see things today.